Night had fallen over southern England. Across hundreds of airfields and quiet villages, the world seemed to hold its breath. Tens of thousands of young men waited in the dark, their uniforms packed, their rifles oiled, their minds racing toward a dawn they could not yet imagine. Inside the canvas tents, light from a single bulb glowed through the fabric, pale, trembling. Some men played cards in silence, pretending the game mattered. Others cleaned their gear again and again, searching for calm and repetition. Letters were written, folded carefully, tucked into breast pockets. Messages meant for wives, mothers, sweethearts, in case the worst should come. The air smelled of wet grass and fuel. Engines idled in the distance. A sergeant walked between rows of trucks, whispering reminders that sounded more like prayers than orders. No one spoke loudly. Everyone listened, to the hum of engines, to the sea wind, to their own heartbeat. The invasion had been postponed once because of weather.
Let's see what you've got,
Now June
soldier.
6th was set. They all knew it. Posters in every command tent showed the map, a stretch of French coast marked with code names. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Simple words that, by morning, would mean everything. A young private sat apart from the others, his helmet resting in his lap. He stared at it as if it could tell him whether he would live or die. He was 19, and though he had trained for months, nothing could prepare him for this. The largest seaborne invasion in history, a leap into fire. Nearby, a medic checked his supplies, bandages, morphine, tourniquets, knowing there would never be enough. He had promised himself he would help whoever he could, but deep down he understood that war rarely allowed time for promises. In the mess tent, an officer tried to give a final speech. His voice trembled only once. He told them they were part of something far greater than themselves, that freedom had waited too long behind barbed wire, and that tomorrow they would open the gate. The men listened, but what each one heard was different. Some thought of home. Some thought of fear. Some thought of nothing at all. At airfields across England, paratroopers loaded into C-47 Dakota transports. Their black painted faces reflected the dim red lights inside the fuselage. They checked each other's gear, straps tight, knives sheathed, reserve chutes packed. When the engines roared to life, no one spoke. The vibration filled their bones. One man whispered a line from a psalm. Another smiled nervously, clutching a photo in his glove. As the planes lifted into the night, the world below vanished under clouds. From above, they could see only flashes of lightning and the cold glint of moonlight on the channel. They were the first wave, the pathfinders, the ones who would jump behind enemy lines hours before the beaches saw daylight. On the coast, sailors prepared their landing craft. They greased the ramps, tightened bolts, checked engines that had to start in the surf no matter what. The smell of diesel mixed with sea salt and sweat. They had been told it would be rough water. They had not been told how rough. Inside one ship's hold, a group of infantrymen sat shoulder to shoulder, knees touching. They tried to sleep, but every few minutes someone shifted, coughed, or whispered a joke that fell flat. One man took out a small harmonica and played a few slow notes, not a tune, just sound to remind them they were still alive. Above them, the paratroopers crossed the coastline. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, orange bursts tearing through the clouds. Tracer rounds streaked upward like angry stars. The planes jolted and banked hard. Jump lights turned green. They leaped. Wind roared in their ears. Chutes opened like white flowers in the darkness. Below them, fields, rivers, and villages, all hidden under a veil of fog. Some landed in trees, some in water, some miles from their targets. But they were in France. The invasion had begun even before the ships touched shore. Back aboard the fleet, the hours dragged. Men waited below deck, counting seconds by the sound of the sea hitting steel. One lit a cigarette and passed it down the line. Another took out a small tin cross and kissed it once. They said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. When dawn finally began to bleed through the clouds, the horizon was filled with ships, more than anyone had ever seen. Destroyers, transports, landing craft, battleships, a floating city stretching to the edge of the world. The soldiers climbed up the narrow stairways to the deck and saw the gray coastline of Normandy waiting for them. Some felt pride. Some felt terror. All felt the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. The night was over. Tomorrow had come, and the world was about to change forever. Before the first light touched the French coast, the sky was already alive. From horizon to horizon, aircraft filled the darkness, the steady drone of engines blending into one endless sound. Inside each plane sat young men wrapped in gear that weighed nearly as much as they did: parachutes, rifles, grenades, radios. They waited for the signal that would send them into history. For many, this was their first time leaving the ground. For others, it would be their last. They couldn't see the sea below them, only the black void stretching forever. But through the small windows, occasional lightning illuminated the waves, white foam against ink-dark water. And somewhere beyond that darkness lay France. The flak came suddenly. German guns opened fire from hidden positions. Tracer rounds rose like fiery ropes crossing the sky. Pilots shouted over the radio, trying to hold formation, but chaos spread fast. One plane burst into flames, a brief, terrible flash, then vanished into the night. Others veered off course, dropping men miles from their intended zones. Still, they jumped, one after another, into wind and fire. The parachutes opened late, whipping hard in the air. Below, the land was nothing like the maps: flooded fields, narrow hedgerows, rivers glinting faintly. Men hit the ground alone, scattered, surrounded by darkness and the distant echo of gunfire. They cut their chutes, drew pistols, and began to search for anyone wearing the same uniform. Some drowned in the flooded marshes before they could even free themselves. Some landed on enemy-occupied farms and were shot before their boots touched the ground. But others, small groups of 3, 5, 10, began to gather, whispering passwords into the dark. They didn't know exactly where they were, only what they had to do: destroy bridges, block roads, confuse the German reinforcements before the beaches came alive. In a small Norman village, an old farmer woke to the sound of gunfire. He stepped outside and saw parachutes drifting down through the mist. He thought at first they might be Germans, another patrol, but then he heard an accent he hadn't heard in years. "Anglais, Américain," he whispered. For the first time in 4 years, he allowed himself to hope. Meanwhile, out at sea, the fleet continued to move forward through the black water. The waves were rough, higher than expected. Men grew sick, vomiting into buckets, gripping their rifles as the landing craft pitched up and down. Above them, the bombers roared toward the coast, releasing their loads over the German defenses. From a distance, the shoreline looked like it was on fire, but not all the bombs hit their marks. Many fell too far inland, missing the bunkers that would soon unleash hell on the beaches. And in the darkness, German defenders, weary but alert, waited behind concrete walls, readying machine guns and artillery. They did not yet know the scale of what was coming. On board one landing ship, a chaplain moved among the men, offering quiet words that could barely be heard over the engines. Some crossed themselves, others looked down. They had trained for this moment, repeated it on the shores of England again and again, but this was real. No drill, no practice, only one chance to make it to the sand alive. A sergeant checked his men one last time, rifles loaded, helmets fastened, bayonets fixed. He didn't tell them to be brave. He simply said, "Stay together. That's all that matters." As the horizon began to lighten, the faintest gray of dawn, the first landing craft lowered into the waves. The wind howled. Spray hit their faces. Engines strained. Some boats spun off course, some took on water, yet every man stayed silent, eyes fixed forward. Some whispered the same words again and again: "Just get me to the beach." Behind them, the great guns of the Allied battleships opened fire. The sea exploded in thunder. Shells screamed overhead, arcing toward the coastline. The earth shook. Every blast lit the horizon for an instant, revealing the cliffs of Normandy. It was beautiful and terrifying. In the villages near the coast, French civilians awoke to the sound of that bombardment. For a moment, many thought the world was ending. But then they saw something new in the sky: parachutes, planes, smoke, and the faint outline of ships as far as the eye could see. They realized the Allies had come. On the beaches themselves, German soldiers stood stunned. For weeks they had expected an invasion, but not here, not now, not at this scale. As dawn broke, they saw the armada appear through the mist, more than 5,000 ships stretching endlessly. Some men dropped their rifles in disbelief. Others ran for the bunkers, shouting orders, pulling ammunition belts into machine guns. The first shells hit moments later. Concrete shattered. Sand and fire filled the air. Communications broke down. German officers screamed into radios that no longer worked. And out at sea, the landing craft kept coming, wave after wave. Back in the sky, a paratrooper unit regrouped near a hedgerow. They had lost half their men but managed to destroy a key bridge. They didn't know it yet, but that single act would stop a German armored division from reaching the beaches for hours, saving countless lives below. As dawn gave way to daylight, the sky itself seemed to tremble. Planes, smoke, and sunlight mixed into one great haze of motion and noise, and through it all the soldiers kept moving, toward the shore, toward the cliffs, toward the fire. By 5:30 a.m., the beaches of Normandy were visible. The men could see flashes of gunfire from the cliffs. Someone whispered, "This is it." Engines revved one last time. The ramps would drop soon, and when they did, nothing in the world would ever be the same. As the first light of June 6, 1944 broke over the English Channel, the horizon was already on fire. The great invasion, Operation Overlord, had begun. Thousands of young men, some barely 20, found themselves staring at the gray outline of the French coast. The waves slammed against their landing craft, salt spray stinging their faces. Inside those boats, time seemed to stop. Every second stretched into forever. Then came the command, "Lower the ramp!" The world erupted. Machine gun fire tore through the front rows before the first man could even move. Bullets snapped through the air, slicing into metal and flesh. The sea turned red. Men stumbled, fell, tried to crawl through the water as shells exploded around them. Some never made it out of the boat. Others jumped into the waves, their packs dragging them down before they reached the shore. There was no cover, no shelter, only chaos. The sand offered no protection, and the beach was alive with noise. Screams, gunfire, the thunder of artillery, the roar of engines, the crash of waves. It was impossible to tell who was shouting orders and who was simply shouting to survive. One soldier hit the ground, gasping for air. His hands shook as he tried to reload his rifle, the sand sticking to his fingers. He looked up and saw the cliffs, impossibly far away, and thought, how can anyone make it there alive? Beside him, a medic crawled through the smoke, dragging a wounded man toward a patch of debris. There was no time to think, only to act. Another group, pinned behind a steel obstacle, waited for a chance to move. The sergeant looked back at his men, soaked, terrified, clutching their helmets, and simply nodded. When he ran, they followed. Most didn't reach the next patch of sand, but some did, and those few would open the way for hundreds more. At sea, the commanders watched through binoculars. Many of the first waves had been slaughtered. Radio channels were jammed with static and broken voices. The tide was rising fast, covering mines that hadn't yet been cleared. But retreat wasn't an option. Every minute they delayed meant more men trapped on the beach, so the order went out, keep going. Further down the coast, other landings faced their own hell. Some beaches met little resistance, the defenders too stunned or scattered to fight. Others became death traps, endless stretches of sand with no place to hide. Each soldier's experience was different, but the fear was the same. Every step forward felt like walking through fire. Behind the dunes, a handful of survivors gathered, covered in mud and blood, their rifles barely working. One man lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Another stared silently at the sea, watching more boats come in. They had no idea if they were winning or losing, only that they were still alive. Slowly, groups began to form, scattered, leaderless, but determined. They moved up the beach using smoke, craters, anything for cover. Some used bayonets when their guns jammed. Others threw grenades into bunkers they couldn't even see. It wasn't strategy, it was survival. Every inch of sand was paid for in blood. By mid-morning, the first breakthroughs began. Engineers cleared paths through the mines. Tanks, those that hadn't sunk in the surf, started to crawl forward, their tracks grinding through the sand. Behind them, medics set up makeshift aid stations, working in the open, ignoring bullets that snapped overhead. They couldn't save everyone, but they tried. In one moment, a soldier saw a comrade fall beside him. Without thinking, he ran back through the fire, grabbed him, and dragged him behind cover. The wounded man whispered, "Leave me." The soldier shook his head. No one gets left. He didn't even know the man's name. But in that instant, they were brothers. Further inland, The paratroopers who had dropped hours earlier were now cutting German communication lines, blowing bridges and drawing enemy fire away from the beaches. They didn't know the full scale of the invasion below them, but they could hear it, a distant thunder rolling through the countryside. Every explosion, every tremor in the ground told them the same thing. The Allies were here. As the day went on, the sea behind the beaches turned into a living highway. Landing craft arriving, ships unloading, medics tending to the wounded, chaplains praying over the dead. Waves carried in ammunition, rations, and reinforcements. The tide washed out, leaving behind helmets, rifles, and the silent faces of those who would never move again. By late afternoon, the gunfire began to fade. Smoke drifted over the cliffs. The men who survived were exhausted, barely able to stand, their uniforms heavy with seawater and ash. Some dug in to hold the ground they'd taken. Others simply sat down and stared at the horizon. Too tired to speak, on one stretch of beach, a soldier looked around at the devastation. The wrecked boats, the bodies, the silence after the storm, and whispered, "We did it," no one answered. But in that moment, he knew the truth. This victory had been bought with everything they had to give. By the time night fell, the beaches were secure. The cliffs of Normandy, once thought impossible to take, were now in Allied hands. But the cost was staggering. Thousands lay where they had fallen, each one a name, a story, a life cut short on the sand, and yet through their sacrifice a new chapter had begun. The liberation of Europe was underway. The tide of war had turned. That night, as the wounded were carried to the ships, one man looked back at the shoreline, now quiet, lit only by fire and moonlight, and whispered to himself, "For those who didn't make it, we'll keep going." When the guns finally fell silent on the night of June 6, 1944, Normandy was no longer a place, it was a graveyard. The sand that had once been golden was now darkened with the scars of war. Every dune, every crater, every stretch of coastline told a story. Stories of fear, of courage, of men who had seen the edge of the world and stepped beyond it. For those who survived, silence was almost unbearable. After hours of unending noise, the screams, the explosions, the roar of engines, the stillness felt heavy, almost cruel. Some soldiers sat alone, staring at their rifles, unsure whether to feel grateful or guilty. Others searched among the wreckage for friends who never made it to the dunes. Each body they turned over was a reminder of how fragile victory really was. In the flickering light of burning vehicles, medics worked through the night. They moved from man to man, whispering words of comfort that few could hear. The wounded asked for water, for home, for their mothers. Many would never wake again. Those who did would remember that night forever. The smell of smoke, the cries in the dark, the sound of waves washing over the fallen. Further inland, paratroopers regrouped in scattered fields. Their mission had been chaos, landing in the wrong zones, cut off from command, yet they had fought through, improvising at every turn. Now, as dawn approached, they counted their numbers. Entire squads had vanished, but those who remained were determined to hold what they had taken. They didn't know it yet, but their stand would save thousands on the beaches below. One soldier, his hands still trembling, wrote a letter home by the light of a match. He didn't write about glory or victory, only about the faces of the men beside him. He wrote, "If I don't come back, tell them I wasn't afraid to go. But I hope they'll remember us, not as soldiers, but as boys who did what they had to." Letters like his, many never sent, tell the truest story of D-Day. Not just strategy and heroism, but humanity, the fear, the hope, and the quiet understanding that tomorrow was never promised. At dawn, the beaches were unrecognizable. The tide had washed away some of the wreckage, but not the memories. Ships still burned offshore. Corpses drifted in the surf. Engineers moved among the ruins, marking mines, dragging equipment, setting up makeshift roads. The war had moved inland, but the beach remained sacred ground. Chaplains walked through the sand, offering last rites. For many, there were no words left to say. They simply placed a hand on a shoulder, whispered a prayer, and moved on. The crosses would come later, rows and rows of them, each marking a name, each one a promise that the world would not forget. Far away, in London and Washington, generals called D-Day a triumph. The newspapers printed headlines of victory, but the men who were there knew better. They knew it wasn't just courage that won that day, but it was endurance. It was fear held back by duty, pain swallowed for a cause greater than themselves. For the locals of Normandy, that day brought both horror and hope. Villagers emerged from cellars and barns, stepping cautiously into the morning light. They saw the destruction, homes shattered, fields cratered, roads torn apart, and then they saw the soldiers. Foreign boys, muddy, exhausted, wounded, but alive. Some French farmers offered bread. Some offered silence. Many simply wept. After 4 long years of occupation, freedom had begun to return, but it came at a terrible cost. By the second night, the wounded were being ferried back to the ships. Many refused to leave, insisting they could still fight. One young medic told a comrade, "They trained us to save lives, but today, we just tried to keep men from dying alone." It was all anyone could do. Among the countless acts of bravery that day, most went unseen. A soldier shielding a friend from gunfire, a man giving up his life jacket to someone who couldn't swim, an officer staying behind so others could move forward. There were no cameras, no medals, no speeches, only the quiet truth that heroism often lives in silence. The next morning, as reinforcements poured ashore, some men returned to the same beach they had fought on 24 hours earlier. They barely recognized it. The bodies had been gathered, the bunkers cleared, the flags raised, but the ghosts remained. Every crashing wave seemed to whisper the names of those who had fallen. Years later, veterans who returned to Normandy said the same thing. It wasn't the noise they remembered most. It was the quiet. The quiet after the battle when the only sound was the sea. In that stillness, something larger than war took root, a deep, unspoken understanding between the living and the dead. Those who survived carried that silence for the rest of their lives. They spoke little of what they saw, not because they forgot, but because they couldn't explain it. How do you describe the moment you realized the world would never be the same again? For some, D-Day ended when the shooting stopped. For others, it never truly ended. It lived on in their dreams, in the flash of gunfire behind closed eyes, in the echo of waves hitting the shore. Time passed, nations healed, and the beaches turned peaceful again. Children played where men once fell, but beneath the sand, the memories remained. Today, when the tide rolls in over Normandy, it washes against history itself. Every grain of sand has seen courage, fear, and sacrifice beyond measure. The men who landed here did not fight for glory. They fought so that freedom might live again. And so, every June when the veterans return, frail, bent, wearing their medals, they stand before the sea and remember. Not the noise, not the orders, just the faces beside them and the silence that followed. Because the real story of D-Day is not just about victory. It's about humanity, fragile, courageous, enduring, standing against the darkness and refusing to fall. This was D-Day, the day the world held its breath. At sunrise, the beaches of Normandy look peaceful now. The sea glows silver, gulls circle above, and the wind moves softly through the grass-covered dunes. Yet under that calm surface lies the memory of the most violent day in modern history. 80 years have passed, but the echoes of D-Day have never truly faded. The invasion of June 6, 1944, was not only a turning point in the war, it was a turning point for humanity itself. It reminded the world that freedom, once lost, demands unthinkable sacrifice to reclaim. Nearly 160,000 Allied troops crossed the Channel that day. Over 10,000 would not return, and among those who did, none were the same again. For many soldiers, the battle ended. For their minds, it continued. The flash of artillery, the cries of the wounded, the smell of salt and smoke, these never left them. When they came home, they carried both victory and grief in equal measure. Some never spoke of it again. Others tried to and could not find the words. History recorded the operation. But memory lived in silence. Sound, distant seagull, a slow heartbeat rhythm under the score. After the war, life moved on. Europe rebuilt itself from ashes. Towns destroyed by bombing were raised again. Children grew up free, running on the same beaches where men once fought for every inch of sand. But even in peace, the legacy of D-Day was visible. In every rebuilt bridge, every quiet cemetery, every flag that still flew. In Normandy, farmers plowed their fields and unearthed rusted helmets, dog tags, and fragments of rifles. They called them the Iron Harvest. Each discovery was a reminder that freedom had roots deep in the soil, watered by the blood of strangers who had come to save them. In the decades that followed, veterans returned to Normandy. They came not as conquerors, but as old men searching for ghosts. They walked the sands slowly, leaning on canes instead of rifles. Some bent down to touch the water. Others stood quietly, staring toward the horizon where the ships once appeared. A few wept, not for themselves, but for the friends who stayed behind. When asked why they returned, one veteran simply said, "I came back to thank the sea for letting me live." These moments, quiet, unfilmed, unseen, are the real legacy of D-Day. Today, the cemeteries of Normandy stretch as far as the eye can see. White crosses and stars of David mark row after row of soldiers who never went home. The grass is perfectly cut. Flowers are freshly laid. Children walk between the graves, holding their parents' hands. They do not yet understand the price of what they see, but one day they will. Every nation that fought that day carries its own story. For Britain, it was duty. For America, liberation. For Canada, courage. For France, rebirth. And for the world, it was proof that ordinary people, farmers, clerks, students, and sons, could stand against tyranny and prevail. But D-Day's legacy goes beyond victory. It asks a question that still echoes today. How much are we willing to sacrifice for freedom, and how easily do we forget those who already have? Modern generations see Normandy as history, a distant chapter in books and documentaries. But for those who were there, it was not history. It was life and death. They remind us that the freedoms we enjoy were not written in ink, but in blood. Every democracy, every vote, every right to speak freely traces back to moments like those on June 6th. As time passes, witnesses grow fewer. Each year, the ranks of surviving veterans shrink. The last voices of D-Day are fading. Soon, the beaches will remember more than we do. And when that day comes, the responsibility to keep their stories alive will pass to us. In museums and classrooms, the story of D-Day continues to be told. The maps, the uniforms, the strategy. But the truest lesson is not found in diagrams or orders. It is found in humanity, in the faces of young men staring at the shore, in the trembling hands that refused to surrender, in the hearts that broke but did not bend. For all its horror, D-Day revealed something profound about the human spirit, that courage can exist within fear, that hope can rise from despair, and that even in the darkest storm, people will fight for the light. Every June, when the tide washes over Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, the waves carry whispers of the past. The sea remembers every name, every breath, every heartbeat that ended there. And when the sun sets, casting gold across the water, it feels as if the world itself is bowing its head in remembrance. The story of D-Day is not just the story of war. It is the story of what it means to be human, to fear, to fight, to fall, and to rise again. It is a story written not in victories, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people who believe the world could be better. And that, perhaps, is the real secret of D-Day, the one they don't tell you. That behind every statistic, every strategy, and every photograph, there was a heartbeat. A son, a brother, a friend, someone who believed in something larger than himself. So when you walk the beaches of Normandy, do not just see the sea and the sand. Listen. The wind still carries their voices. And if you listen closely, you'll hear them whisper, "Remember us."